everyone. It's so lovely to see this warm crowd on a midweek evening to come pay tribute to Annilese Wagner. I won't speak of her. I did not have the pleasure of knowing her, but if her photos are any indication, she looks like a large-hearted, warm soul. And the people I do know in this room who speak so highly of her, I can definitely say that if you can judge someone by their friends, then truly a fine person she must all have been. I'll say a few words about the Writers' Center. As you know, we're supported by generous institutions such as the New York State Council for the Arts, and Arts Westchester, as well as individual foundations, including the Fundera Foundation and the William E. Robinson Foundation and the David G. Taft Foundation. We're mostly, however, supported by our very generous students and patrons and clients and members, and all of you here tonight. I welcome all of you. And without further ado, thank you everyone for coming.
Annilese Wagner was a longtime board member during the early years of the Hudson Valley Writers Center. She was one of 4 poets, including Stephanie Strickland, Patricia Farewell, and me, who worked together to establish Slapping Hall Press. In her autobiographical afterword for her chapbook Murderous Music, Annilese writes about her realization of the significance of her experience as a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, even though most of her memories from before she was 13 had vanished. She writes about her native German language, which she describes as a, quote, hills of Kentucky kind of speech, quote, inventive, vigorous, and musical. She also talks about how her mother had a lovely singing voice and how her lute was part of the luggage when they arrived in the United States. One of Annilise's qualities that I remember most vividly in working with her is the musicality of her spoken voice and of her poetry. She had an abiding elegance of presence, both in her written and spoken words, that will always be with those of us who knew her. Another remarkable event that Annilese recounts in her prologue is that after she received an MFA in poetry from Sarah Lawrence College, Jane Cooper asked her to teach her class. Surprised because she hadn't taught before, Annilese asked Jane why she had invited her. Jane told her that she thought she could do it. Annilese stated that the 2 people who had a cataclysmic impact on her life, of course measured on vastly different scales, were Hitler and Jane Cooper. The latter because she believed in Annilese and believed that she could write and teach. This leads me to another observation. For many years, Annilese ran the Hudson Valley Writers Center reading series. She possessed a humble and hard-working spirit and worked well with other people. She knew how to get things done, but without fanfare and self-aggrandizement. She also had a tremendous depth of knowledge of the field of poetry and helped to feature many exciting writers at the Writers Center. We are honored to be able to celebrate her life and the work of Annilese Wagner tonight, and we welcome everyone who has come to join us. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Elise Wagner. I'm Elise's older daughter, and I'm here before you today also on behalf of my sister, Carrie Wagner, who lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, so could not be here. And I just want to tell you a little bit about my mother's life, a little biography. She was born in Hudson, which is in southeastern Germany, near Bavaria, on May 3rd, 1929. Her mother was Mina Metzger, who was born in Krausheim, and who came to Heinzheim, her husband's village, which was the tradition. When a woman got married, you went to the village of where your husband lived. Her father was Isaac Oppenheimer. He was a cattle trader. At that time in Germany, Jews could not own land, so that was a profession that many Jews were involved in. My mother played with a young girl named Hilda Hof, who lived across the street. Hilda's mother, Annilese Hof, tended the Jewish graves during the Second World War until the Nazis made her stop. We are still friendly with Hilda's niece, Annilese Hof, who visited my mother only last summer, and actually Annilese is going to be coming to my daughter's wedding in November, so we're still very much in touch with that family who lived across the street. My mother's family came to the United States in 1937. They came as the result of the hard work of her mother in writing to anyone she heard of in search of the necessary affidavits that were required for entry by the U.S. government. They were sponsored by a family who lived on a farm in the Catskills, who were not relatives. They left their bucolic village in Germany and moved to the Bronx. None of them spoke any English. Both of her parents worked all the time. Her father as a laborer, her mother as a maid. Annilese started public school in the Bronx. When the teacher asked her her name, she said it was Annilese Oppenheimer. The teacher said that was too long, and her name would be Anna. Anna graduated from Taft High School. The guidance counselor told her she shouldn't even think of applying to small private colleges. The best she could do was NYU. She attended NYU in the late 1940s, early 1950s. She met her friends Fan, Marilyn, and Herb, who were her friends for life. She was introduced to Dylan Thomas at Cafe Reggio as the prettiest girl at NYU. She worked in her parents' luncheonette in Woodridge in the Catskills during the summers. One summer she went to London to visit her aunt and uncle, Tante Greta and Uncle Moritz. At some point she went to a party with her friend Fan, and she met Bob and Raleigh Wagner. Bob was a graduate student at Columbia, where Anna was studying for a master's in English. She married Bob in 1953 at Mount Nebo Synagogue. They spent 1 year in State College, Pennsylvania, where Bob was teaching English 0 or something like that to football players, I think. Then they moved to Mount Vernon, New York, when Bob got a job at Sarah Lawrence College. I was born in 1956, just before they moved to Hartsdale, and my sister Carrie was born in 1959. Anna was a suburban housewife, although not a typical suburban housewife. She went into the city whenever she could to go to museums or other exhibits. She was a co-leader of my Brownie and Girl Scout troops. She was involved in social justice efforts, Head Start, fair housing, and Project Able. She was always involved in the arts, painting, dance, and poetry. At some point, she came to understand that she was a poet. She went back to school and received an MFA in poetry from Sarah Lawrence College. She also came to understand that she was Annilese, not Anna, and went back to her original given name. She spent time at artist colonies such as Yaddo and Blue Hill, which she loved. She taught at Sarah Lawrence in the continuing education division and at many other places. At one point, she taught a class in Mount Vernon, and she brought me to a party there at the end of the summer. And this was a group of people with very little education and from very different backgrounds than she was, and she really connected with them, and they really loved her. As Margot said, she was an early founder of the Hudson Valley Writers Center, and she was so very proud of that. She was thrilled to become a grandmother, first in 1988 to my daughters Leah and Alice, and then in 2003 to my sister's daughter Rachel. She developed a wonderful relationship with Kevin Sullivan. She loved to travel, and they took many trips together. She had many, many wonderful friends, many of whom are here today. My mother struggled valiantly with Parkinson's, and I believe she never gave up. Her body became too weak to sustain her, but her will to live never wavered.
going to read a poem that she had written called Saturday. And as Margot was talking about Annalise's voice, I only hope that I could give justice to the beautiful lilt that was part of Annalise's poetry, the way that she read her poems. Saturday. As if tears are rain, I washed my face this morning. As if God is my uncle, I sit on his knee. Saturday morning on the steps of the synagogue, I was the right height for my father's blessing. His 2 hands on my head, sure roots for the coming week. Saturday afternoon, from home through stucco walls of houses, my mother, like God, saw everything, saw me playing alone on the path along the Neckar, my red ball rolling into the reeds, me running after it. Look at your muddy shoes, pity you didn't drown. My mother tore from my hands the wildflowers I picked for her. She hit me hard across my ear. I can't hear myself or God cry. Rain is the river of God's tears.
I am first going to be reading a poem by Jim Finney, who was a classmate of Annilese and mine and Ernest at Sarah Lawrence. And he unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but he wrote a poem for the occasion for Annilese. It's no good to rush. A life is filled with waiting. Growing up, outliving your youth, yearning for something in yourself that needs an outsider to point at. Oh, that, you say. And only later, oh, that. I can be a glass full of bubbles, a floating flower with no roots, a thought that keeps coming back in different shapes and forms. I'm so much more than I ever knew. And then on my own behalf, I am going to read Annalise's poem, Greenhorn. When I read about the old-time rich at their Adirondack camps, I think of maids lugging chamber pots, men skinning deer, guides scaling trout, women stoking stoves to cook 7-course breakfasts. And remember my first job, age 13, waiting on table in fancy Rockaway for Mrs. Epstein and her sister Edna, the two taking 4 meals a day under a crystal chandelier, heat trapped by draped windows, droplets beating their upper lips. More pie, Mrs. Epstein said. Serve coffee on the right. In the pantry, I detoured around the butler's pistoning pelvis until my free hour between lunch and tea. Barefoot walk on the beach, giant waves crashing. From a silver platter balanced on one hand, I served roast beef, pudding, and potatoes, smiled, asked, "More gravy, ma'am?" Mrs. Epstein didn't ask for working papers, said she likes greenhorns. They work hard. Summer's end, she gave me $100 and her old lizard handbag from Ecuador, a baby lizard pasted on it.
From Murderous Music. I understand that when I managed to get this copy of Murderous Music, I probably could have been accused of petty larceny. These days, I understand it could be stepped up to grand larceny. It's worth quite a bit more.
Just be a little bit louder?
It's worth quite a bit more. Thank you. To begin with, I'd like to call everyone's attention to the epigraph of Murderous Music. It's a quote from Paul Celan, and I assume that Annilese did the translation. A kind of silence came, the storm came too, and all the oceans came. Anyway, I'd like to read just some excerpts, if you will, of murderous music. From the afterword. The poems, I quote, "The poems in Murderous Music are different from my other poems, more autobiographical, more narrative in style. As I was writing them, I realized that material I had previously suppressed. My experiences as a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany was not only difficult to use in poems, but also important." And to finish. I want to say how I came to the phrase murderous music. My mother had a very lovely voice. When she sang, which was seldom, it was songs she learned as a young woman in Swabia. Her lute was a part of our baggage, and when we arrived in the United States, it hung on the wall for a few years. Then, when singing seemed incongruous to her life as a cleaning woman and salesgirl, it disappeared. When she moved to Florida, already quite old, I'd visit her and she'd sing old songs again. We listened to German records. The music brought back the good parts of my life, which I had denied along with the bad parts. However, music never brought back my elusive memory. The murder part, of course, is hindsight. The music had undertones of peril all along, but German Jews preferred to ignore it. Once in a while, at a movie, when the director wants to allude to Nazi Germany, a snatch of the Horace Wessel song is played. I quote it in Salt. "When Jewish blood spurts from the knife." I always begin to cry, even if I am in a perfectly good mood and the movie is good. That bit triggers tears. I don't remember hearing the song when I was a child, but I must have heard it. There were loudspeakers strung on poles all over the village. It must have been very frightening music for a young child. Now I'll read the Salt poem. Salt. Someday I will learn to love the ocean, jump waves, dive and chase a seaward ball, laugh while sputtering brine. Plucked from its lap, salt blinded, I will sit and hear its gruff lullaby. Someday I will love the ocean, its rightful child, delivered across high seas by the Columbus Registry Norddeutsche Lord. During a slaughter of raw wind and sea, foghorn unending, my mother says, "You look, Aryan." A charm too weak to spell her and daddy too. She prays out loud the first night on the channel. In the salon, above our heads, brown shirts sing, "When Jewish blood spurts from the knife." Jump or push, 3 Jews would make a tasty snack for sharks. In terror of blows in the brig, my father strokes nervous knuckles on his hand. Beneath us, the ocean rolls its loop-de-loops while we sit on our bunks as gongs announce dinner and breakfast, the bureau wedged against the door. In Southamptons, the brown shirts in civvies descend the gangplank, soccer balls and nets slung like carbines. We sailed on without them, climbed to the top cold rail, released into the savage wind, 8 chancy days to walk the German deck, waiting for sun on the fog-wrapped, roistering Atlantic.
I want to read one of the poems from this beautiful translation of Elizabeth Borcher's poems, which Annilese entitled Fish Magic, and Gabrielle Wicker has very kindly volunteered after my gentle arm twisting to read the German first. So I'm going to let her read what is practically the first poem in the book, and then I'll read the translation.
Thank you very much. Eierwasser regnet Schlaf. Eierwasser regnet Schlaf. Abend schwimmt ins Gras. Wer zum Wasser geht, wird Schlaf. Wer zum Abend kommt, wird Gras. Weißes Wasser, grüner Schlaf. Großer Abend, kleines Gras. Es kommt, ein Fremder.
Was sollen wir mit dem ertrunkenen Matrosen tun? Wir ziehen ihm die Stiefel aus, wir ziehen ihm die Weste aus und legen ihn ins Gras. Mein Kind, im Fluss ist dunkel, mein Kind im Fluss ist nass. Was sollen wir mit dem ertrunkenen Matrosen tun? Wir ziehen ihm das Wasser an, wir ziehen ihm den Abend an und tragen ihn zurück. Mein Kind, du musst nicht weinen, mein Kind, das ist nur Schlaf. Was sollen wir mit dem ertrunkenen Matrosen tun? Wir singen ihm das Wasserlied, wir sprechen ihm das Grasgebet, dann will er gern zurück. Es geht ein Fremder ins große Gras den kleinen Abend, im weißen Schlaf das grüne Nass, und geht zum Gras und wird ein Abend, und kommt zum Schlaf und wird ein Nass. Eier, schwimmt ins Gras der Abend, Eier, regnet's Wasserschlaf.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful. I'm also indebted to Gabrielle for correcting my pronunciation of a key word here, which you could repeat it, which is, I guess, more an expression than a word.
Eier.
So, water rains down sleep. Water rains down sleep. Evening swims in grass. Who goes to water goes to sleep. Who comes to evening comes up grass. White water, green sleep. Big evening, little grass. Here comes a stranger. What should we do with the drowned sailor? We pull off his boots, we pull off his shirt, and lay him in the grass. My child, it's dark in the river. My child, it's wet in the river. What should we do with the drowned sailor? We pull the water over him. We pull the evening over him, and we carry him back. My child, you mustn't cry. My child, it's only sleep. What should we do with the drowned sailor? We sing the water song for him. We say the grass prayer for him, and he'll gladly go back. There goes a stranger. In tall grass, the little evening. In white sleep, the green water. And goes to grass and becomes an evening. And goes to sleep and becomes water. The evening swims in grass. It rains down water sleep.
Annilese was such a writer and such a committed writer. You guys probably know, since you knew her, that when she was physically having trouble writing, and Kevin would help her, try and send out work, but after a while it became too hard for her, and she would write in her mind, and she would write in her dreams, and in her dreams watch her hands write and read what her hands were saying. I remember at the end of her life she was telling me that what she had was her dialogue, that her dialogue was really important to her. Her dialogue with the disease and what was happening to her. This is a strange poem from Murderous Music called Brown Shirt. It's a prose poem. Brown shirt, walking the pine needle path along the icy road, I passed a tree with a big iron nail jutting from the trunk. I hung my mind on it and told myself, all is not lost. You still have your heart and soul. So I kept going until I came to a cottage at the end of the street. It looked like the house I was born in. I decided to knock. The woman said I couldn't be the girl who used to live there. That girl grew up to be a movie star. So I knocked on the door of a neighbor. No, he barked. he doesn't want a vacuum cleaner, and slammed the door. But the third person, an old man in a faded brown shirt, said, "Stand in the light." Sure enough, he recognized the scar on my forehead. "So you came back to where it all happened," he said. "Yes," I said. "I want to hear you tell about old times. It used to be safe," the old man said, "to walk in the forest."
Leather apples. Brown fuzz skin, dribble of spicy juice on the tongue. In one tub, a handful of tart September pungency conjures up cider in jugs, stored all winter in the root cellar. At every meal, the pitcher's aroma. Looking across the fields and treetops, up towards the ramparts of what was a walled town with spires, words well in the throat, taste like gnarled, tough-hided apples, my down-home German dialect, mangled and specific as creature speech, slow as country time, nothing better for laying curse or speaking love. Mouth and tongue scoured, replenished with vocabulary fresh as green walnuts, my first language returns in snatches of song about the miller. Traveling is the miller's joy. There was no miller, no mill, no redress from verbotens, no place to go, no place to hide, only an hour, that last stolen afternoon when my young mother sang as we strolled through the forest. From America, this is what I come for. Melodies to draw their loved, lying words in my mother's firm soprano from the orchard of leather apples with all their murderous music.
There are two people who couldn't be here today who sent me words to repeat. Annilese said, "I was sad to read of Annilise's death. I remember her beauty, her poems, our shared European childhoods, and how we entered America with another language on our tongue." And Charlotte Mandel wrote this poem for her, in memoriam Annilese Wagner. Undeliverable as addressed, unable to forward, stamped on the unopened envelope of my final letter to you. I address this now to the image lifelong in my thought. Bright, slim, soft-haired figure, face and form fired with a quality that fostered enduring friendship. Poet who could focus on the surface of a flower, a work of art, a man, woman, or child with aim that laid bare revelations within. Your phrasing, subtle, unexpected. No other could write so creative an essay on the simple act of walking. You analyzed my words in ways that uncovered the poem's unconscious desires. We met at poetry events, were roommates at a festival at Bucknell University, and in Manhattan, you by train from Westchester, I by bus from New Jersey, to museums where shared impressions of paintings or objects deepened meanings for us. Because I edited your collection, Handwork, I call up memories of American childhood as a refugee from Nazi Germany. Your poem of a Hopper painting sings as I tour a new showing of his works at the Whitney,
a favorite site for our coming together. Illness robbed us of those meetings, yet time disappeared at every phone call, the bond between us never changing. Your address is written inside my mind's vision, where you are alive. I visit you there, as you still visit me. And I'm going to read a poem called Break. Annilese wrote, I like the crunch of hard things. Whole wheat rounds split and dried in the oven from the bread store on Prince Street, where the man with tar black hair eats on the oilcloth table behind the sliding curtain with his little silver mother. Bread I like hard, for the roar taking my skull, the avalanche of oblivion, its vocabulary racing over the twisty roads of my brain. I want to hear storm winds wrench a splitting willow limb from its trunk, raw wood rip away with the howl of a cat in the pain of heat, splinter and tear off butt naked until it claws down the side of the house, strikes the grass, lands upended, spine not broken, riding the shriek of the break given first full voice.
I'm going to read a poem titled Our Stories, which is from Annilise's first book, Handbook. Our Stories. I twist tongue, lick ABCs from honeycomb above the blackboard, while savage numbers giggle in a row. We heathens speak no English. Eins, Annilese, zwei, Mutti, and Papa, in their bed, dry, I snuggle in. Fear, in my village yard, laced into new patent shoes, I stick to the kitchen step until Mutti spreads paper over the chick shit cobbles, until bang, an oven door slams my house down. At PS Atlantis, the Bronx, loops Annilese until you're in America now. Floats a black swan off the double fold. Anna charms me from digits across my forearm, from count, division, from 0, minus, freeze, mother, eyes. From names without letters and bone chip numbers that flake on windy days, off ash pits, from tallow kin. Your stories.
Besides teaching poetry, Annilese also taught memoir writing. And what I'm reading now is basically a memoir of her two grandmothers. So two grandmothers. It looks long, but I've cut a lot. I'm not reading everything. I would have liked to have read everything, but it would have been too long. There were no grandfathers. Both died before I was born. Oma Emma and Oma Berta, the two grandmothers, both widows, were born about 30 years before the turn of the century. They retained the convention of hair parted in the middle, braid bunned at nape, and long skirts covered by a perennial apron. In Oma Berta's house in Heinsheim, my father, his siblings, and I were born. The height of frivolity for the grandmothers was to don a blue and white polka dot apron, the only exception they permitted themselves from widow's black. The hierarchy of aprons ran all the way from rough, for picking potatoes in the garden, to good, a show apron of black sateen. God forbid even a hint that work was not in progress should be detected. except of course on the day of rest, on holidays, on making a visit, and at bedtime. In my ear, I still hear the command, "Put your apron on," as if a dirt-flecked dress would indicate an unclean character. My parents and I arrived in the States in 1937. My grandmother Emma joined us in 1940, and she and I shared a bedroom. In that room, her feet on a low stool, the emotional spectrum ranged from hopeless black to cheerful yellow. Although dear David had died in 1904, she told me that she had never looked at another man. At their engagement, Emma and David shook hands, and a year later, on their wedding night, the first kiss kindled their lips. Oma Emma's escape from Germany began in an easterly direction to Prague, and eventually, after ninth-hour papers arrived, continued westward. She boarded the last plane, along with the fleeing Czech President Dr. Beneš, to Amsterdam. For years, she rehearsed this story for me. A woman who had hardly absorbed the switch from horse-drawn wagon to railroad car, she was tucked into a narrow seat on a rickety plane and transported into the sky. I knew if I didn't die on the flight, she told me, I might live forever. After Amsterdam, then what? How would she fare in a metal tub on so much water with submarines buzzing beneath her for 2 weeks? She arrived in Hoboken. The New York skyline unscrolled before her eyes, eyes that never wore glasses, though she lived to be 71. Oma Emma died in April 1945, within a week of Roosevelt's death of the same illness, a cerebral hemorrhage. At her funeral, a relative, seeing my grieving face, said, "It's better that she's dead. Who knows how she may have had to suffer." I wanted to hit her. How could it be better for Oma to be gone? I'd lost my best friend, my roommate, the fingers that dried my tears when my parents threatened during their tireless spats to break up their marriage. Oma Emma provided a bridge to the freedom I'd lost years back, the rural child's paradoxical world of delicious rambles and potential dangers. Oma Emma, in the privacy of our apartment, permitted the old world secret entree. She'd tell me stories of adventures and betrayals, love matches and pious acts, some that took place years before the turn of the century. In turn, during long hot summers in the confines of our apartment, I'd tell her the plots of books I carried home by the armful from the library. My proficiency in English, useful for the family, was regarded as an inborn trait, much like the ability to wriggle one's ears. I had unlimited freedom to read anything the library permitted me to borrow, as long as I finished my chores first. Same with homework. Reluctance to sweep the carpet daily was tantamount to committing a sin. Reading, since it required no physical activity other than moving the eyes, smacked of laziness, of amusement before work. Actually, the radio had higher value, since one could unstring beans or hem a skirt while listening. The simple old ways were best. Every nail, every stray jar top was recycled or stored. Peasant frugality required the practice of ecology, long before it became fashionable or necessary. My parents' 6-day-a-week, 10 to 12-hour work days barely covered rent, food, and the gas and electric bill. Oma Emma baked bread, resoled shoes from the inside with cardboard, converted my mother's skirt into a dress for me, and instructed me how to iron my midi blouse with our antique iron. Detachable cast iron slabs heating on the gas stove, one heating while the other one was in use, the sizzling one then hooked on to the wooden handle. I lived in Heinsheim with Oma Bertha as my daily companion for the first 8 years of my life. In America, Oma Emma replaced her through my early adolescence. At times, conflating them into one, into grandmother, feels natural. Not one shred of memory remains of Oma Berta. I know how she looked only from the face pasted on the inside of a small, otherwise empty album she gave me as a parting gift. An expression of equanimity and strength emanates from classically even features. She knew when she gave me the little album and inscribed it in ornate Gothic script, July 1937, for remembrance on emigration over your grandmother Ottenheimer, that we'd never see each other again. Some of the pictures break my heart. The first, taken the day before the emigration, the Auswanderung, the fiendishly ironic wandering out, shows my parents and me in our new clothes on cobblestone streets surrounded by medieval buildings. The site was obviously and naively chosen by my parents to lend traditional grandeur. The second picture, taken about a year later, shows my parents and myself posing on the tar-lined roof of a Bronx apartment building. My father is almost unrecognizable. He had lost more than 30 pounds. With unemployment high that year, and as foreigners with no skills, no English, and cursory grade school educations, my parents took any jobs they could get. In that year, my father had lost his first job of builder's helper, carrying sections of iron for fire escapes, because he fainted after 5 days. Finally, after weeks spent searching for a job, on foot to save a subway nickel, he found work as a dishwasher in a seedy bar and grill on 34th Street in Manhattan. A 12-hour-a-day job he welcomed with glee. At least so it appears in the photograph. My mother, after switching from cleaning woman to garment worker, seems to be caught in that photograph in transports of the same glee as my father. Her hand is braced on my upper arm as I stand in front of them. Is she signaling me with a quick squeeze to give my best smile? We were desperately trying to exude a sense of well-being, which makes me think the picture was staged for Oma Berta, a copy sent to relieve her anxiety about us. I'll never know if Oma Berta saw that picture. When the SS came to get her in October 1942, they gave her 1 hour to pack. Recently, during my latest visit to Heinsheim, I asked my hostess, my childhood friend Elizabeth, if the removal of my grandmother from her house had been noticed by her family, since they lived across the street. Yes, she said, they saw her taken out. At the time, with only a quarter of a stomach after a radical operation, Oma must have looked more frail than she generally did. What could this bewildered old woman have had the presence of mind to pack after the certainty, suddenly demolished, that they wouldn't take her, that she was no threat? Her fields had been sold, she had no trove of valuables, she had been a good citizen and neighbor. What could they want of her? She wanted only to stay in Heinsheim near the grave of Abraham, and when the time came, to be laid in her plot beside him. Where did they take her? I asked my friend. To the town hall. That small structure, which houses proof of Ottenheimers as residents of Heinsheim from the inception of public records, is 3 houses and the breadth of a tiny common from Oma's house. They kept her there until the trucks came next morning. After a moment, Elizabeth, her eyes misting over, said, on a hard wooden bench, my mother wanted to bring her a blanket, but we didn't dare approach the guards. The grandmothers, so much alike in background, did not arrive at similar deaths. Oma Emma died in the bed next to mine and is buried in New Jersey near her children. Oma Berta has no grave. She was shipped to Gurs, a camp in the Pyrenees, a sizable trip from southwestern Germany, made to seem even longer since no destination was given. For 2 years, she lived in a freezing barrack with 6 people. All slept on pallets covered by verminous blankets, fed on rations of gray water called soup, and suffered frequent illness. Via the Red Cross, she managed to send us 2 postcards. Thinking of you with much love. She knew that to say more would activate the censor's black marker. My father's eldest brother in London had money stashed in Switzerland and had managed to arrange huge bribes to have Oma released. Just before the rescue could take place, Oma Berta slipped on icy mud and broke her hip. Some nuns tended her in a convent, almost 80 years old and limping. She was shoved into a cattle car, pitched out into the hippodrome in Drancy among masses of people pressed together in unspeakable conditions, and then several days later stuffed into a cattle car to Auschwitz. I doubt that after days and nights penned in that hellhole, she was among the ones still breathing when the train arrived. Nevertheless, the Auschwitz ledger records Berta Ottenheimer, resident of Heinsheim, wife of Abraham. What sort of person was Oma Berta? I have 2 sources, my mother and a Heinsheim-born great cousin who recently died in Berlin. My mother hated her mother-in-law, hated her with an ugly passion that lost none of its rancor through time. In her 88th year, she said, "Your Oma Berta deserved the death Hitler gave her." What had Oma done? According to my mother, Oma Berta ruled the house autocratically, required my father to give his first allegiance to her before his wife, and used my mother as a slave, despite the availability of a servant. Great cousin Nellie had a different view of Oma Berta. Nellie had retired to Berlin after many years in Israel. When I visited her there, she told me that Oma Berta had been popular in Heinsheim, an exemplary woman, and generous, Nellie said. She always had an apple or a bonbon in her pocket for a passing child. It broke her heart to lose you forever. My mother had told me Oma Berta favored my cousins over me. No, Nellie said. You were the apple of your Oma's eye. She loved me, yes. But did she torment my mother? I'll never know. Perhaps earlier, coming as a young bride to Heinsheim and living in great-grandmother Adelheid's house, she had been the brunt of her mother-in-law's dissatisfactions. If Oma Berta really did treat my mother cruelly, it changes nothing. All that heartache, the age-old rivalry of mother and daughter-in-law, is blown away. A quaint practice now in light of the powerful wind that buffeted one Oma west and one east, saved one but lost the other. All I know is that both of them knew the old way of spreading their long skirts across open knees to make a commodious lap for their granddaughter.
Annilese was and is the most important person in my life, and I'm happy to be able to read one of her poems tonight. It's from her last unpublished manuscript, which is called The Short Rope, and the poem I've chosen to read is called White Sleep. After a day in the city, the heart in an ocean of milk stews soft for strangers with twitching fingers, for a friend with bruised hands, for the man out the door who took a bite and gave it back, the one on the sill who didn't. In its vat, the heart works hard as the earth, rotating to gut commands that make north drift a few seconds westward each year. The planet throbbing at full speed on radioactive debris left over when some giant fist pressed universal stuff together, when pieces fell into each other's hollows, held on so the world could start, so I can lie down day or night, close my eyes and summon white sleep, the kind without dreams, sleep of the forgiven, white page sleep, given to yogis but denied to the man seated on his piece of city pavement, writing in his notebook, page after page, script over scripted line, black looping linked spirals spilling his own alphabet, telling the story while it happens. I asked to read last just so I could make some thank yous. First of all of you who came to the reading tonight and participated in the tribute to Annilese. I'd also like to thank the staff of Hudson Valley Writers for making it happen in such a beautiful way. And I would especially like to thank Margot Stever and Stephanie Strickland, who really spearheaded the effort to make this tribute happen. During the summer, I came across what I think is a nice photo of Annilese and Margot and Stephanie that I had framed up. It's on the windowsill there. It kind of represents the original founders of the organization, and I'd like to give it to the Hudson Valley Writers Center as a memento of tonight. So just thank you all again.
This is so beautiful, and it truly inspires the work that we do here to know that we're building on a legacy of such magnitude, really. Thank you so much. And please, we have some books on display, Ryan there in the back, collections that include Annalise's work, and these are early Suffering Hall Press publications. And I know Annilese would be so thrilled the way the reputation of the press has just grown and grown, and truly has a national and international scope at this point, with translations of Suffering Hall Press authors around the world. I think, given her background, I imagine that would do her proud. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.